Well, welcome everyone today. My name is Dr. K, and today we're going to be talking about governance generally and then specifically within Quai Network. Before we get started, just want to give a brief overview of Quai. So Quai uses a hierarchical network of merge-mined blockchains to dynamically increase throughput while maintaining security guarantees which are similar to something akin to Bitcoin. With that introduction, let's talk about what is governance. Let's talk about it very broadly, and then we'll move more specifically as we go through the presentation. But governance is the process or policies that organizations and societies use to make decisions. Historic forms of government, I just have a few listed here, but include monarchies, plutocracies, oligarchies, and laissez-faire. Laissez-faire meaning let the sort of market decide how to manage things. In terms of blockchains and blockchains forms of governments, I'm not going to be comprehensive here, but just sort of to highlight a few that may or may not have ties to the historical forms. But if we look at Ethereum, we could think of that as a monarchy, i.e. Vitalik is king, and there is an evolving roadmap that he dictates at whim, and everyone kind of goes along with it. There's probably, been more roadmaps than there have been months since the launch of Ethereum. Then you have something like Solana, which maybe is a little bit more of a plutocracy, meaning it's controlled by a small group of money interest that potentially... Actually, Solana's, that's a plutocracy. So it's a stake system, and it's controlled really by sort of a small number of stake nodes that control a majority of the assets in the system. Then you have something like Ripple. Ripple we could think of maybe as an oligarchy, where we have a permissioned set of nodes, which is sort of a committee that controls things similarly to an oligarchy or monarchy, but it's more than one person doing it. And then we have Bitcoin, and many would argue that Bitcoin is a laissez-faire technique, wherein the market dynamics and the incentives in the system sort of create an emergent outcome, and that manages the system. However, I would only say kind of here, specifically in that Bitcoin has needed to make changes which are outside of the original protocol, and the reason it needs to make those changes is because it is both technologically deficient as well as not having sufficient or properly designed incentives to answer some questions that have come up with blockchains since its introduction. So in spirit, it's certainly a laissez-faire thing. In practice, it maybe turns into a form of oligarchy wherein a certain number of miners and core contributors control the protocol. But in summary, governance bestows decision-making authority on a small number of people. And what is the justification for governance? Broadly speaking, it enables dynamic adaptation of rules to meet evolving needs and challenges. In society, our justifications for it are that we have to adapt to technological changes. One of the major justifications is to create more efficient markets, and I put efficient in quotes there because some people have enough hubris to think that a single person can understand the emergent properties of a complex system better than the system itself. The third point here is that and this is probably actually the best justification for governance within society, but that is to regulate and manage externalities. When we talk about externalities in society, those are things like polluting the air or dumping, toxins in the stream if you're doing a production process, and if you're not directly paying for that in your production process, that's an externality, and the government steps in such that those common goods and resources are sort of protected and managed. In blockchains, the biggest thing that people say is to adapt to changes in technology in blockchain, most people don't talk about efficient markets because we at least don't have that level of hubris. But then the other thing that's interesting in blockchains is the need to regulate and manage externalities doesn't really exist per se, or it is at least a pretty constrained set of things you must manage because it's a artificial environment, right? It's a digital environment. So when we talk about externalities in blockchain, you could say state rent is a sort of an externality, but it's only an externality in that you haven't created an incentive to deal with it. But in terms of having these sort of open-ended externalities like pollution or noise or CO2 or something like that, doesn't really exist in the blockchain. The points of resource consumption, use, and sort of detriment are relatively known and relatively constrained, so we don't actually have the issue of needing a subjective open-ended system to deal with externalities. We can probably just address the specific externalities that exist because they are finite in number. Another way to say that are that we need to adapt to changes in technology, pardon my French, but what blockchains are really saying is our shit sucks and we need to fix it, but we don't know how, so please trust us. That is really what we're saying when we say that we need governance. So governance in a blockchain system is a symptom of poor design and technology. And before we go into governance more, I kind of want to step back and talk about cryptocurrencies. Specifically, what is the value proposition of a cryptocurrency? And when people define Bitcoin, they define blockchains, they can come up with a large number of very obtuse definitions that are hard to understand. But when I think about what cryptocurrency value proposition is, what it actually does is that cryptocurrency is an objective system for globally transmitting digital value. And that is its value proposition. It is an extension of the concept of a protocol called TCP/IP, which was standardized back in the mid-'80s. That is how the internet transmits information. But up until the introduction of Bitcoin, we didn't actually know how to digitally represent and transfer value. So the revolution of the internet was we can globally transmit information. The revolution of cryptocurrencies is we can globally transmit value. That's our value proposition here. There's potentially other value propositions, but this one is just so big and so overwhelming compared to any of the other value propositions that until we are all using cryptocurrency as a monetary system, none of the other applications even should remotely raise anybody's interest. So that being said, let's compare cryptos to the previous system and what we kind of would say is our ideal form of cryptocurrency. So if we understand that the value proposition of cryptos are to represent and transmit digital value, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to replace the monetary system that currently exists. So that means that we have to create something that has a store of value, it has a unit of account, and it has a medium of exchange. So let's first look at what previous monetary systems did, and then kind of what an ideal cryptocurrency would look like that would be able to replace that monetary system. So presently in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve. It's managed by the Board of Governors, which is an oligarchy. It has rules which are undefined and they change with time. So monetary policy, interest rates, and open market operations are kind of at the whim of the Board of Governors. And they can change interest rates from 0% to 5% in 12 months and cause regional banks to go bankrupt, SVB. It's centralized. There's no auditing. There's no transparency. There's the potential for censorship and obviously tracking of all transactions in the system. The ideal cryptocurrency, on the other hand, is that we want a system where the participants compete in the system and the system itself competes with other systems. We want rules that are defined, but they can be dynamic. So just because we say we have a static rule set doesn't mean that the rules can't endogenously measure properties of the market and respond appropriately. But most importantly, we want a cryptocurrency to be objectively verifiable and trustless. And wrapped up in that word objective is one of my strongest arguments for proof of work over proof of stake. But we won't go into that one. So to maintain objectivity, the rules in a cryptocurrency cannot change. So how can we get these two things to work together? How can we get an ideal cryptocurrency, and how can we have governance? Are these things even compatible? Well, there's different types of governance. There's political governance, and political governance, as we all know, is a very subjective process. It's a social process. But most importantly, the rules can change in seemingly arbitrary ways over time. And also important is that the participants may or may not agree with those changes. So for example, if I'm in the United States, I find myself in a system of political governance. We could have a new board of governors appointed to the Federal Reserve that has a very dovish policy, which would cause the dollar to inflate, which would directly impact the savings that I already have within the system. And that arbitrary thing happened. Now, you could say that that person was appointed by an elected official, i.e. the president. But when we talk about the president, then even if I'm in a democracy, which technically we're not, if for people that actually know history about the United States, we live in a representative, a constitutional republic. The idea of the electoral college system is not by accident, is by design, but each state has different degrees of sovereignty. Besides the point here, though, the way that we ultimately elect a president is through a vote that goes through the electoral college, but you can have 49% of the populace disagree with who's elected, but they have no sort of recourse. So the Board of Governors of the Fed, who's appointed by the president, maybe 49% of the country doesn't agree with, but they can't do anything about it. They're just stuck within this system. And that is a symptom of political governance. However, if we introduce this concept of objective governance, and we only have objective, measurable rules, we can change this calculus quite considerably. So we don't want to create a mechanism to change the rules, and we want to create rules that are simple but have complex emergent outcomes. So instead of having to have a set of laws that can fill, a million pages of text, we actually would ideally have one, maybe two rules within the system, but it's designed in such a way that the emergent complexities of the market participants make that system adaptive, vibrant, and efficient. Now, that's obviously a lot more difficult than sort of creating rules as we go over time. You have to be much more considerate to make something that is concise, that sort of encompasses the incentives required to make that vibrant, efficient market. So it's much more difficult to do this, but if you do it, you should be able to do it in a way that is sustainable and static for market participants. That being said, that means that if the rules don't change, every participant in the system has agreed to the rules because they've entered the system. So when I buy Bitcoin, I'm agreeing to the rule set that exists under Bitcoin at that point in time. If Bitcoin does a hard fork in a proof of work based system, I technically have an option of not adopting the hard fork and I can defect. And that is not a fault, but a design choice. The concept of having to have active reparticipation in the system at the point of a rule change is kind of the point of proof of work in a lot of ways. We want everybody in the system to agree to the rule set, and have the option of leaving if they don't want to participate in a change. So properly designed rules are both simple and they create emergent outcomes which allow for evolution of the system. So let's talk about protocols. And what is a protocol? A protocol is a set of rules for data or value exchange over the network, and an example here would be TCP/IP. But the characteristics of a protocol is that it creates a standard, so everyone knows what the rules are and everyone can sort of verify the rules are being followed in a specific way. It also creates a communication mechanism so that people can talk over this standardized set of rules, and it has error handling. So if there's an error in a communication, that can be detected and it can be handled, and there's also ordering. So we need to know what sort of messages or communications came one before another. This is actually the biggest problem with blockchain. If you actually think about what it is, it's an ordering problem. We order transactions in blocks and we order blocks in a chain. We're just trying to order things in time, but without having a dependent synchronous mechanism. But that's effectively what the challenge of the blockchain is trying to solve, is a standardized communication mechanism that has error handling that allows us to accomplish the ordering of transfers of digital value. That's a blockchain. So if you think about what I just said, a blockchain is a protocol. Very, very clearly, a blockchain that is trying to function as money is a protocol. Now, that being said, protocols should be these very static systems that are very simple, right? They do a couple things and then they do those things very, very well. But they don't have a lot of complexity. That's where we get this concept of adaptive layering. So with a base layer of a blockchain, I can build complex systems that the blockchain didn't anticipate by using the standardized interface and services that the blockchain provides. But I don't need to anticipate every application that gets built on the top in the future. And again, if we go to the TCP/IP analogy here, nobody anticipated email, let's say, when TCP/IP was invented. They certainly didn't anticipate HTTP or HTTPS. They didn't anticipate Java. They didn't anticipate, the CSS. They don't have to anticipate these things. They just build the layer in the stack. And since 1985, there really hasn't been many, if any, meaningful changes to TCP/IP, but we've built the whole internet and communication protocol on top, all of those applications on top of this one protocol. So that's an example of how we can get a tremendous amount of unanticipated modularity, interoperability, and evolutionary growth on top of a very, very simple protocol. And so what we're trying to do with a blockchain is do our core value proposition, which are value transfers, but do it in a way that allows more complex applications to be built on top. So a protocol allows static standardization while facilitating evolutionary growth. And let's compare a protocol versus software. So one of the problems with blockchains and sort of the ethos that has been brought to these things is people have been thinking about blockchains as software rather than protocols. So they have frequent updates that can create minor changes to the system or create very dramatic changes to the system over time. And if we sort of compare an idea here of, again, TCP/IP being a protocol versus something like Windows being software, we can see that in the last, 35 years, Windows has had 16 major updates and an innumerable number of minor updates, where something like TCP/IP, which is a protocol, we started using it in 1985, we're still using it today, has had 2 minor backwards compatible updates, SAC and IPv6, and that is it. And those happened within the first 10 years of development. So the reason that you can do that is because TCP/IP has exactly one task, which is to transmit information. Whereas something like Windows has an innumerable set of tasks in scope. It has to deal with drivers. It has to deal with software. It has to deal with new types of software dependencies. It has to deal with evolutions in graphics and graphics design, and evolutions in hardware, going from hard disks to SSDs to cached RAM on chip, and so on and so forth. It has to go from 32-bit architecture to 64-bit architecture, from single core to multi-core. There's a litany of dependencies that Windows has. Whereas TCP/IP is an abstract protocol whose purpose is to do one thing, which is to transmit information. So even if we go from 1 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig, fiber, TCP/IP still works in that setting. It didn't have to change to accommodate an evolution in speed or an evolution in the physical layer. It's just a protocol. We didn't have to change it so that we could do SMTP versus FTP versus HTTPS. It doesn't know. It accommodates all of them because those are abstract application layers built on top of it. So the cool part is that if you build a protocol and you build that protocol well, it doesn't need to change with time. It's perfectly interoperable. We built the entire internet on something that was conceived 35 years ago and hasn't changed because it was designed properly. So cryptocurrency should be a protocol that doesn't need to change. That's the conclusion. Now the question is, how do we do this? And we do this through incentive design. Incentive design you can think of as light touch emergent strategy of governance. So what is incentive design, or what is good incentive design? Incentive design should have a dominant strategy. So if we're playing a game, if I don't have a dominant strategy, I can't have a predictable outcome. I want to create an emergent form of decentralized money through the incentive design. So we can say Bitcoin was an attempt at that, but Bitcoin really represents one thing. It represents a store value, and it doesn't have a long-term sustainable security model, right? So we need to design a system that sort of answers these problems. But with good incentive design, we want a set of rules that should also maximize the efficiency of the system. So if we can do something for cheaper, or we can create greater utility for less cost, we should figure out how to modify our rule set to do so. And then the last thing with incentive design that sort of circles back on dominant strategies is that your rules should be seeking a stable equilibrium. If you're not seeking an equilibrium, you can't come out with sort of a predictable outcome from a given rule set. Now, the other thing that we're wanting to do within incentive design specifically to cryptocurrencies is we want something that I call adversarial cooperation, meaning we are competing, but our competition creates cooperation. So we want our incentives to create adversarial cooperation. And this is the mechanism that prevents the rules from changing within the system. The fact that Bitcoin has miners, it has holders, it has transactors, and it has exchanges. And each one of these people has a slightly different economic interest in the system, causes this system to be very static because they fight each other. If the miners went and said, hey, I want to double the mining subsidy, all of the holders are going to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't want to double the mining subsidy. Now, we can talk about the sort of equilibrium of power within the system and hash and how it manifests. That's a secondary discussion to the fact that there are active participants that have stake within the system whose incentives are misaligned, or they're not misaligned, they're in competition, right? So that competition, though, is what makes it hard for the miners just to say, I'm going to double the amount of supply, or I'm going to go from proof of work to proof of stake, so on and so forth, right? The miners like to have fee revenue, but the users want to have bigger blocks. These sort of competitive conflicts are what keeps the block size from changing. It's what keeps fees where they are, but it's what enforces the static nature of the system. And in reality, incentive design is governance. And if we have a problem with the network, what we're really saying is that we have a problem with the incentive design. So in Bitcoin, we have these issues and we have these shortcomings. What we're saying is we have a technologically deficient system that didn't have a comprehensive incentive design. That is it.
But is now a good time for some questions, Dr. K? We've got a couple of good ones in the chat.
Yeah, let me just get to the last one and then we can rock through it.
All right, let's do it.
So proper incentive design is static and objective, laissez-faire form of governance. So the other thing that you have to say here, though, is it's hard to get things right the first time. But the argument I would make is that this isn't the first time. What Quai is trying to do is be the last mover in the blockchain space, not the first mover. So we have numerous previous experiments to highlight the problems with current designs, both from a technological standpoint, but also from an incentive standpoint. And these are a list of known problems, and in parentheses, how we're solving them within Quai. So state rent is an obvious known problem because it causes the state size to grow without bound, which makes it so that we have limited throughput for the system and we have unbounded costs to node participants. And the way that we can address the state rent issue is through state staking. We have a transaction ordering problem, which arises from a mal-designed market by having a different market for adjudicating intra-block ordering versus inter-block ordering, and this manifests as what people know as MEV, or miner extractable value. And the way that we're solving that within Quai is through mined transactions. There's this sustainable security problem within Bitcoin, specifically related to the fact that once the inflation subsidy continues to decrease, there won't be enough payment to the miners to maintain security. This stems from two things. One, the technological deficiency of Bitcoin and its inability to scale and generate fees through transactions. And then even if it could technologically scale, it would still have a second problem, which is the asset itself is a hoarded asset because of the deflationary model. So having a single store of value asset within the system, even if that system can scale, does not create a sustainable security model. You need something that is a unit of account and a medium of exchange, which is also encouraged to circulate so that you can generate fees and pay for your security. So how are we solving this sustainable security problem within Quai? Is through the introduction of an energy-linked token called Qi, which will be relatively stable over time by being linked to the price of energy. You have the issue with hoarded assets, like I said. Again, Qi solves that problem. You have an unoptimized network in these traditional systems, but the incentive for mining Quai creates an incentive for miners to topologically organize into optimized subnets. We have a selfish mining problem in something like Bitcoin, but Poem solves the selfish mining problem by making withholding unprofitable. We also have an artificial resource limit that exists in pretty much every blockchain system. And Poem, through the ability to create a sharded, coordinated hierarchy of blockchains, which can scale with demand, we can remove that artificial resource limit. So 15 years of experiments informs how to make a fixed and efficient protocol, and that is our goal with Quai Network. With that, we'll go into questions.
Amazing. Thank you for all of that, Dr. K. We've got a bunch of community questions here. I'll make sure to get to everything. I want to start before we talk about any of these questions. You mentioned that, all of these disparate incentives from all these different actors is the reason that these protocols are able to stay immutable. So my question to you would be, how did the merge happen if miners were clearly not willing to do it and there was like a split in the user base? Why was that change able to happen?
Well, so there was a fork, right? And you got your POW Ethereum. But the reason I think that change was able to happen is because it was broadcasted from the beginning. So when prior to Ethereum launching, they said we want to go to proof of stake, but we're going to start with proof of work. And Vitalik even coded in the Ice Age, so to speak, or bomb, or whatever he called it. But basically, they kept on creating this mechanism where over time, the difficulty in the network would precipitously rise, slowing down block production time, so that people would be forced to coordinate to adopt new updates and releases. And that's how they were kind of planning in the stake system. So that particular case, the agreement sort of was when Ethereum started, even if it was only in word, was that we would eventually move to proof of stake. I think that is why it was successful. If you tried to do that with Bitcoin, I don't think it would work.
I think they did try to do it with Bitcoin. There was a large campaign. I don't know who funded it, but Greenpeace and a couple other organizations were advocating to move Bitcoin to proof of stake, and it never gained any traction. But yeah, we'll come back to that for sure. There's a couple interesting questions I want to get to. Mosin asks, so how does Quai approach governance and decision making regarding protocol upgrades or changes related to the consensus mechanism, so proof of work? What mechanisms are in place for both community involvement and consensus around any changes like that?
Yeah, so we don't plan on having mechanisms because we don't plan on having changes. That's basically it. If there is a mechanism, there's going to be like a break and we're going to fix it. That's really sort of all there is to it. If somebody else wants to fix a bug, they can fix a bug and get people to adopt it. Or if they want to write a new client that's more performant, all the power to them. Client implementation is independent of protocol.
Got it. Got a question from Kishore that I think will be an interesting discussion. Kishore says, in objective governance, you say that every participant agrees to the rules. This is only possible through political governance because humans are involved here. Not everyone is going to agree with all the rules. There has to be political consensus to move ahead. Papsazak says, in my understanding, if you don't agree to the rules, you just don't use the system. And Kishore follows up asking, is it my way or the highway for a blockchain that wants to be a protocol / function as money?
Well, so each participant at every change has a decision point that they get to make sort of in aggregate with the other participants. So if you are a single person that doesn't like the rules, you still don't have to continue to participate in the system. You can certainly exit. If there is a larger cohort, you may decide to bifurcate. And those are all options to you, and all of that optionality is organic, healthy, and voluntary.
Yeah, I think a fun point to mention is that anyone at any time is able to fork Bitcoin.
And sell Bitcoin.
And make any change you want. The challenge is getting other Bitcoiners and other people in crypto to accept your fork as a legitimate thing. And so that's kind of, in my understanding, Dr. K, the governance that Quai will have as well, that anyone is able to make any changes they want. It's just, are you able to convince people that your changes are better than the status quo?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I'll make another point here. There's this concept of sort of like a cult of personality, right? So Ethereum and Vitalik are clearly an example of that. There's some examples within other projects. Sergey and Hodgkinson, etc. I think early on, there will likely be bugs, and to sort of be efficient in patching those, you want people who will be looked to fix those things. But over time, if the system is to remain static, there can't be a cult of personality involved. So Satoshi, I think, did a good thing of stepping away. We could argue that Satoshi was maybe early in doing that by a few years, but overall, I think it's probably one of the strengths of Bitcoin is that Satoshi is no longer involved.
That's a good point. And Kishore, I'll get to your other question as well, but this fits in perfectly. Kishore asks, out of curiosity, when do you think is the time for the founder to let go of his or her project?
Well, there's two parts of it, right? The second that the network launches, the founders let go of it because the system itself is now this aggregate um, set of people responding to an aggregate set of economic incentives. Right. During our last testnet, we had an event where basically every piece of our infrastructure went down. We weren't running a single node. We weren't running a single RPC. We weren't running a single service. And what happened to the network? Nothing happened to the network. We got our infrastructure back up. We synced back in. There were absolutely no disruptions. Right. So a decentralized system that's properly decentralized is more like a fungus, right? It's just this thing that's sort of seeking out nutrients and lives on its own and does things. So the second you actually launch Genesis, you're giving away control. Which is the point. Now, that being said, you do have soft power, which is if something breaks, people will look to you to fix it. But at the time where those things start becoming controversial, or if there's a set of controversial things, or if you're sort of mutating away from the original specification through that use of soft power, that's where founders, I believe, are detrimental to the goal of creating incredibly neutral money. So there's no time frame, right? It depends on adoption. It depends on technology. It depends on evolution. It depends on a number of things. But sooner the better, I think, is the answer. Like I said, I think Satoshi was a little early, but yeah.
Got it. Another question from Kishore that I think I would agree is an important distinction. Can we make a distinction between the protocol itself and the software on top of the protocol, where the protocol is robust and has definite rules set by the founders, whereas the software changes and is carried out by the community?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the point that like I'm trying to make between protocol and software. So a protocol turns into a set of rules, which are independent of the applications built on that, and they're independent of the clients that run it. So you can have as many clients as you want, you can have many as applications as you want, but that's independent of the protocol. The protocol is just that definition of what the rules of cooperation are and sort of what the incentives around that cooperation are.
Yeah, and I'll throw some examples out there just so everyone can understand what we're talking about. But right, I think the most popular Ethereum client is still Get or Go Ethereum, which was the original client that was written in Go. But there's been a lot of work. I want to say, Dr. Ken, a Rust client, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So that's been in the work for a long time. I think that might be available now.
Yeah, no, it's Reth, right? And it's actually way more performant than Geth. And then it was pretty funny because basically, what's his name? Karalabe, there it is. Wow, that took me a minute. Karalabe has kind of been like sitting on his laurels with the performance of Geth over time, and it was funny to see Reth come in because it was like so hyper performant that it started taking market share, and then suddenly it like lit a fire under Karalabe and the foundation because they were going to lose that element of control within the system, and then suddenly every day Karalabe was like tweeting about a new performance improvement that they'd like figured out with the database or encoding or something.
There you go. So yeah,
it's pretty funny.
Right there, that like competition in the software is actually hugely good for the protocol. And then even like the software that sits on top of it, like I can think of countless examples of like the new ERC 404 standard was created without any protocol changes. I know there's some reworking of the ERC 20 standard that has happened without any protocol changes. So the software that sits on top of the protocol can change, and that can be done via community or even an individual dev. The governance we're talking about is really more the base protocol and the base rules. Got another question here from Kishore. And I think this is from, I'm not sure what this is from Kishore, but Kishore is quoting something and says, any good governance stack needs democratic assent, typically by voting, some form of institution to streamline the governance, and constitutional representation, basically hard to change rules. How do you see Quai through these lenses as far as the community coming together to bring about changes?
Again, the goal here is not to change anything. So building those things into the system are greater risks than they are rewards.
Got it. So I think I would say we have no democratic representation. Obviously, there's no, Quai is not a governance token. There is no institution to streamline the governance because there's a, it's the protocol. And then the constitutional representation, like hard to change rules. That's what Dr. K is talking about with like the different incentives for different groups.
That's right. We're trying to program the system to create stasis.
Yep. Kishore also asked, do you ever think there would be a standard matrix or measure of decentralization, or will there ever be some sort of consensus on how decentralization is defined?
Oh. So the word decentralization is a hell of a word because it's used so easily and understood very poorly. Everyone uses it, no one understands it. That's like a huge problem in our space, and because it's been such an ill-defined term, people have come up with these excuses and variations on things that were cryptocurrencies, and they like masquerade as cryptocurrencies, but they've sort of lost the plot, and nobody realizes they lost the plot because it's hidden in the complexity of that term. Right? I think proof of stake was certainly an example of that, and then we've had more egregious examples where you take proof of stake and you centralize it further and further and further, and then you have enshrined rollups with proto-dank sharding, and then suddenly like everyone's just creating overly complex databases that are completely ununiform, have their own token, have their own liquidity, and it's just a mess. So that word is like one of the best words and one of the worst words in the whole entire thing here. But when I think about decentralization, I think about economic decentralization, and I think about adversarial resilience are really the things that I think are like the right metrics, because decentralization for the sake of decentralization is not meaningful. The point of decentralization is so that you have credibly neutral static system that is adversarially resilient. So the question becomes, if I want to define decentralization, I really should probably just be talking about my adversarial resilience, I think is like the key point. And we can look at adversarial resilience from a statistics standpoint. We can look at it from an economic standpoint. We can actually also look at it from a political standpoint. And I can give examples of each one of those. If we look at it statistically, we're trying to efficiently measure a process in a work-based system. Poem measures that process with mine transactions, measures that process pretty much as efficiently as you possibly can within the constraints of the network, i.e. the internet, so that you get a statistical finalization of your transactions as quickly as possible within this hierarchy of scaled sharded sets. The economic incentive is that it's work-based, so we have a unique economic commitment to the history and the chain, so it would be incredibly costly to go back and mutate history over time. Whereas in a stake-based system, the only cost to mutating a transaction would be the coordination cost of re-signing a series of blocks. The last one in terms of adversarial resilience is how hard would it be to attack to make the safety and liveness be compromised to a high enough degree to make the system lose its utility to the people that are using it. In that particular case, what we're talking about is the cost of the attack. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to generate the greatest amount of revenue. The way that I do that is I create the greatest amount of utility for the greatest number of people at the lowest cost. And then I match supply with demand so that we can generate the highest aggregate economic surplus for all participants in the system. That will also maximize total aggregate revenue with time. and that total aggregate revenue in a work-based system, given an efficient consensus mechanism, i.e. POEM, represents the adversarial resilience in terms of economics. So we would like to figure out how to generate more revenue. Right, transaction throughput clearly does that. Increasing the size of the network and utility clearly does that. Mine transactions take some proportion of MEV and contribute that directly to chain security, so that increases that adversarial resilience. There's other aspects of adversarial resilience that are political. So for example, if I can use something as money and people start using it as money, it's going to be much harder to ban that. If everybody's using it to buy their groceries every day, good luck banning that from a political standpoint. So political is a point of adversarial resilience. That means that the money system needs to scale. It needs to have low fees. It needs to have self-custodianship. Taking it away from people, that's a political thing, right? If I have gold and I say, hey, I'm going to come and take gold out of your safe, that's one thing. But to say, hey, I'm going to take the keys out of your head, that's a completely different thing, which is really politically untenable. So those are all aspects of adversarial resilience. But I think the fundamental question that you're asking when talking about decentralization is adversarial resilience.
I would agree with that. And I think that's a lot of what we mean when we say that proof of work is more decentralized than proof of stake. It's not, the by the book terms that most people will reference, node requirements, stuff like that, so much as it is the censorship resistance and the, attack vectors for governments and like massive organizations to try and make changes and take things down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me look at, okay, another question here from alexrp.eth. Dr. K, will you be gone and leave Quai behind just like what Satoshi did?
Yeah, so my goal is to create the new monetary system for the planet. And I will do whatever is most effective to do that, which can include stepping back.
Got it. Yeah, I do think that you mentioned this before, but part of Bitcoin's decentralization is that there's no founder, there's no single figures to point to whenever there is controversy or disagreement. And I think that is important for long-term decentralization, is that things get figured out amongst equal parties in the community rather than, having a foundation or a team kind of giving direction and then the community is just along for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, ideally too, again, if this is a protocol, like I said, with TCP/IP, it hasn't changed. So like if you look at sort of the governance around TCP/IP, like it's emergent, but even if it's emergent, they're not actually doing anything because nothing needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, fair take right there. And so I have a question that I'll ask before I go to Kishore's next question. So looking back, I think this was in 2014 or 15, the DAO hack on Ethereum is kind of, when I think governance, is one of the first things that comes to mind for me. So for those that are unfamiliar, there was, the first DAO was put together on Ethereum. It was backed by the Ethereum Foundation. And there was an exploit in the DAO that allowed an anonymous person to essentially withdraw a disgusting amount of ETH from the DAO, essentially hacking for a large amount of money. And that is what Ethereum Classic is. So there was a fork where Ethereum Classic left the hacker's ETH in his wallet, and then the current Ethereum that we all know and use today basically forked, took his money away, and said that hack never happened. So my question to you, Dr. K, would be, how would something like that happen in Quai if there was like a large scale hack, assuming, something horrible happens and maybe all the exchange liquidity that we provide to some exchange gets siphoned off somewhere? Like, how does the network react to something like that?
Yeah, very simple. If it is a bug in the protocol, it should be fixed and patched. If it is outside of the protocol, it is what it is. So, for example, in the DAO hack, if there was an obvious bug that was exploited in Solidity that existed, that would be a protocol problem. You should mitigate that. If it is a problem, this smart contract that was written by the developer that was independent of the protocol, you shouldn't do anything.
Understood. And so I guess more I'm looking not even for your personal take on it, but if something like that happened in Quai, would you be around to advocate for a fork? Would you kind of let things play out as they'd play out with the community, or would you advocate against a fork?
I think it depends on the time frame, right? So like early on, I think, myself and dominant strategies would be the ones sort of proposing the path forward and the solution based off, the articulation I just made. Long term, ideally those things don't happen or they stop happening because their protocol works, and no one really needs to intervene. But I think in some ways there was the parity hack, where Gavin, who was one of the co-founders, ended up having a multi-sig smart contract that had a bug. It was a really funny one too because it was just like you could just destroy the contract, just arbitrarily. So they had it as like this templated contract, and then somebody just called destroy on the contract, and then it just like deleted it from the chain, and all the money was like locked up because the contract was gone to move it. But in that case, I think there was $150 million lost in Ethereum, and they didn't do anything about it. That also shows an evolution in maturity. But I fell on like the ETH Classic side of this conversation, specifically within the DAO fork. I don't think that was the right call. Again, I think it's there's a distinction between the protocol, and say the sort of original client bugs versus things that happen on top of those things, right? So an exchange get hacks, a bad contract's written. It's not the problem of the system. It's a problem of the people that did that.
Fair enough. I think it's a fair take. A question here from Kishore: do you think dApps on Quai would be considered clients as well?
In this conversation, no.
Got it.
So like, if I don't know if she has like a more specific question, but in delineating sort of what you should mitigate versus what you should not mitigate at the protocol level, dApps are not part of the client. Absolutely
not. Ego asks, if there's a need for an improvement from what has currently been built in Quai Network, how is that decision going to happen, and who will implement that?
The goal here is not to need improvements. Again, it's a protocol. The improvements that were proposed to TCP/IP were IPv6 and SAC. Neither one of those was actually required. It marginally sort of increased efficiency and scale, allowed for sort of IoT stuff, but IPv6 I think still only has like a 20% adoption rate, even though it's been rolled out for 15 years.
So there are EIPs though, and even Bitcoin has Bitcoin improvement proposals. So will there be QIPs, Quai improvement proposals? Will those be, voted on, implemented? Like, how will that process work?
Yeah, again, there's quips right now, and the idea here is that people have input. They should go comment on the quips, or they should go add a quip. Now is the best time to do this sort of stuff because it's the easiest to do, and making a change that is better, that's non-controversial, here is great. I think there can be non-controversial changes in the future, but let's take an example of Bitcoin and the block wars. Right in 2017, there's big debate ongoing about increasing the block size. And just to be clear, the sort of the big blockers and the small blockers, I guess. That's an example of something sort of needing to change to sort of improve the system in aggregate. The reason it was so controversial, though, is because you had the miners who have a short to midterm outlook, and then you have sort of holders and users which have a mid to maybe longer term outlook. And so what ended up happening is the miners were generating revenues from fees because there was constrained block space, and the miners like that. They like, getting paid $10 a transaction, but users don't like that. And in the long term, it also constrains sort of the use and network effect in the system. And so you kind of had these debates going back and forth about if block size should increase or not. The deficiency here is the fact, well, and this is like not actually deficiency, right? Like the whole thing in terms of stasis and economic design, the reason this change was so hard and took like 2 years to do was because of sort of the stasis that is created through those countervailing incentives, right? We had like the users versus the miners. And that's why that was such a hard thing to get done. And the compromise they did actually was bad. It was a mal-designed system, right? That's been sort of exploited by ordinals. I'm not saying ordinals are bad, but I'm saying having two markets with two prices for the same resource, i.e. bytes in the chain, is always going to be a dumb decision. But effectively in SegWit, the sort of extra data they have is like 1/4 the cost of the sort of original data. So they increased the block size, but did it by like creating 2 segments of data, and this data was 1/4 the cost of that data. So they effectively quadrupled the block size, but they also did it at a reduced rate, which is what Ordinals is now exploiting. So all in all, I think it changed the Bitcoin protocol. If you ask me if Bitcoin is Bitcoin, I would probably tell you that it's not, to be honest with you. But that's part of the evolutionary process of an open decentralized system, right? Ideally, though, obviously that won't be a factor here, right? The goal here is we have 15 years of data. We know where the markets are mal-designed, and we've figured out ways to fix all of those mal-designs. So we don't anticipate there being an infinite space that we haven't already addressed. Now, if there were a space, depending on where the protocol is in time, maybe I'll propose a solution and maybe people will go with it, maybe they won't. But the goal is at some time frame, like the solution's been tested, the solution works, and that's what the solution is. And if people want to make a new solution, they're happy to create a fork. They're happy to fork the code base, start a whole new chain, and compete with it. Like that's the goal here, right? The interesting thing about blockchains, and some people don't get this, is they're anti-fragile systems, right? To borrow a term from Nassim, and they're evolutionary, right? So if we want to like have this sort of robust system, I'm not saying we're going to get the perfect answer. We don't need to get the perfect answer because of the network effect, by the way. We just need to get heuristically optimal answers, and then the network effect will cause that to be the dominant solution, regardless if it's 100% efficient. If it's 80% efficient, it's still going to be the dominant solution because 20% efficiency isn't going to get you past that network effect barrier. Now, that being said, if we go back to the concept of being anti-fragile, the point of having the lack of governance thereof is to make it very hard to change the system. But the point of it being open source and the point of allowing people to have forks in a proof of work like system or create their own chains is also part of the process, right? Every time there's a hack, every time there's a thing that fails, every time that there's a mal-designed market that gets exploited, that's information to the system in aggregate, not just the blockchain, but the people, the aggregate society and community and engineers that's thinking about this problem. That's input. And there's this huge economic incentive to solve those challenges. So every time something happens, that's like a disease, that's a sickness. And then people look at that and they say, okay, how do we respond to that? And then they respond to that in a new way that alleviates that problem. That system just became more robust. It doesn't matter if it happened within Bitcoin. It happened somewhere in the system and the idea became relevant. And if that idea and that capability is economically worthwhile, it will eventually manifest, right? So like part of the goal is like we're in this evolutionary tree. At some point, there's going to be a trunk, right? And that trunk is going to hold up most of the mass, but that doesn't mean that the tree still won't have branches.
Okay, I've got one last question for you, Dr. K. You've talked a couple times about how like organizations like USDT, Tether, and USDC Circle have an outsized influence on governance decisions. Can you explain why they have that influence and how you could mitigate that?
Yeah. So the issue with USDC, let's say, for example, let's say we had proof of work Ethereum, and when we had proof of work Ethereum, there's $100 billion in USDC hypothecated on the chain, and Ethereum was worth, say, $500 billion, right? So it represents sort of 20% of the value of the system. In the case that there was a fork in the rules, because USDC will only exist in one place, and the place in which it exists will be decided by Circle and the people, so Coinbase, Circle, etc. That decision effectively is going to have a very strong outcome on what the change in the rules is going to be. And that could be a fork too. And it could be a fork that is completely against the designed purpose of the system. So let's say that Janet Yellen came in, or Jay Powell came in, whoever this is, and they say, okay, Coinbase and Circle, if you want to maintain access to the banking system so that you can continue to do business as an on-ramp, off-ramp for cryptocurrencies, you need to only process on top blocks that only have OFAC compliant transactions in them. Not just include only OFAC transactions, but don't even build on blocks which are not OFAC compliant. They would have an outsized say in making that happen, even in a work-based system. So the fact that we have this non-endogenous asset, i.e. custodial USD in the system, makes us dependent on USD and the powers that control USD. Like that's obvious. And honestly, I think Ethereum is most likely sort of, in some ways, I wonder if Ethereum is most likely the mechanism by which the CBDC is implemented, honestly. Right? It's very traceable, very little privacy. It's now under a stake-based system, so the plutocrats will love that. They can control interest rates again, and then they can arbitrarily mutate rules because they are so interdependent on the US dollar denominated system that they can own the chain. So like you think it's Vitalik, but if there's enough USD on the chain, it's Janet Yellen. Like clearly controls Ethereum. So the whole idea of Qi is to create an endogenous mechanism by which we have a unit of account and medium of exchange, and trying to alleviate competitively the dependency on USD to maintain a independent system from the current system. Because right now, any system that's dependent on USD is becoming dependent on the system itself.
Got it. I think those are great explanations. This was a fun conversation. I think that governance is like you said, it's a bit of a less technical topic, but it's definitely something important and that everyone should wrap their heads around. Sorry
if I wander a little bit in describing these things. They're complicated, and right, I've been thinking about these things over many years. But we're trying to understand the pitfalls that we've seen, understand the deficiencies that we see, and address those into hopefully a sustainable system.
Before we wrap up, Dr. K, this is something that, I don't know, people in the community might be interested in, but I'm sure you've seen the market over the past couple of days. Do you think that Quai's launch will be expedited, slowed, or will nothing change?
We are working as fast as we can.